From the Republican National Convention in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, we welcome you to Balance of Power alongside Kailey Leinz. I'm Joe Mathieu. Welcome, Kailey, to day 3. We just got the rundown on the schedule here, and over the course of the next couple of hours, we're going to be hearing from a lot of voices in Milwaukee, speaking tonight in some cases, or last night, depending on the schedule here. And Kailey, it looks like a big one for J.D. Vance. This is a night that this whole crowd has been waiting for.
Yep, the vice presidential nominee slated to speak at 9:30 p.m. local time. That's 10:30 p.m. Eastern time on a night in which the theme of the convention for night 3 is Make America Strong Once Again. Tonight is going to be largely about foreign policy.
Yep.
And listening to J.D. Vance talk about foreign policy will be very interesting for our global audience as we get more on his ideas about Ukraine, China, and other threats the U.S. is facing.
Not a big fan of U.S. support for the war in Ukraine. I suspect that President Zelensky will come up. It'll be interesting following a couple nights of attempted unity to see how the crowd follows along.
Yeah, of course, there'll be other speakers as well. Congressman Matt Gaetz, Anna Paulina Luna, others, including J.D. Vance's wife and former President Trump's son, Don Jr., will all be speaking tonight. So it's going to be a stacked affair here in Milwaukee.
You said it. Let's get started. Bring you right to the matter here with Bloomberg's Tyler Kendall getting us started tonight. Tyler, what are you looking at on day 3?
Yeah, hey, Joe. Well, as you mentioned, tonight's focus is going to be foreign policy. Everybody is going to be watching now Vice Presidential pick J.D. Vance's speech tonight. And it's interesting that it comes on the night when foreign policy is the highlight, because he has been one of the staunchest opponents of Ukraine aid in the Senate. Now, I want you to take a listen here. I had the chance to catch up with him back in February when that big supplemental assistance package, which included aid to Ukraine, was stalled in Congress. And he was one of those senators who was saying that we should not pass it. Take a listen to why he was going to do that, what he told me when I actually had the chance to catch up with him in our Bloomberg DC offices.
We're actually sending weapons to Ukraine so fast that it's eliminating our ability to plan for a contingency in East Asia, in the Middle East, or something else that would affect our own national security. So it's good to make more American weapons with American workers and in American factories. It's bad to send them overseas at a faster rate than you're actually building them.
Previously called the war in Ukraine unwinnable. Bloomberg News is reporting European officials say Vance's nomination is fueling anxiety that allies will have to do more to keep U.S. assistance to keep flowing, with one Ukrainian official calling the nomination, quote, a very difficult scenario for us. You heard Vance there advocate for replenishing the U.S. defense industrial base before all else. It strikes a similar tone to former President Trump on the issue, promoting more protectionist policies. Now, Joe and Kailey, as you know, former President Trump, when he was in office, threatened having the U.S. withdraw support from NATO, urging other allies in the alliance to up their defense contributions. J.D. Vance has said similar things as well.
Well, and Tyler, when we think about protectionist policies, often we also think about tariffs. And we know that both J.D. Vance and Donald Trump have had their eye on China in that regard. What should we expect to hear about that this evening?
Right. Well, when you heard Senator Vance referencing replenishing our defense industrial base, he's talking a lot about those rising tensions in the Indo-Pacific and making sure that the U.S. military and our own weapon stockpiles at home are up to the levels that they need to be, particularly as Bloomberg News continues to report on China building up their own military capabilities. Now, shortly after he received the nomination earlier this week, one of the first statements he made was that he feels that China is our, quote, biggest threat that the U.S. is facing.
All right, Bloomberg's Tyler Kendall live with us in Milwaukee today. Thank you so much. And now we're joined here in our studios in Wisconsin by the governor of Mississippi, Tate Reeves. Welcome to Bloomberg TV and Radio, Governor. It's great to have you. As we look ahead to the speakers of this evening, and of course the headliner, the vice presidential nominee, J.D. Vance, what are you hoping that he focuses on? What message do the people of Mississippi want to hear from him? Well,
what I will tell you is I believe that J.D. Vance is the candidate that is most likely to govern like President Trump is going to govern. I also think J.D. Vance is a huge addition to the ticket because J.D. Vance's story speaks to rural voters in places like Mississippi, but also rural voters in Wisconsin, the state that we're in now, and rural voters in Ohio, obviously, but Pennsylvania and Michigan. And we find ourselves at a time in American history where everyday Americans are struggling. They're struggling because of inflation. They're struggling because every time they go to put gas in their car, it costs significantly more today than it did 4 years ago. Every time they go to the grocery store and they buy bread and milk and other essentials, it costs significantly more than it did 4 years ago. And I believe that J.D. Vance's story and what he will tell tonight is going to highlight those facts, that he grew up in a difficult environment. And quite frankly, all of those things are true because of policies enacted by the Biden administration that were intentional. They intentionally increased government spending significantly, which led to higher and higher inflation, and it's hurting people back home.
Well, obviously, that spending that came out of COVID followed enormous spending by the Trump administration that added trillions to the debt. And we're talking to economists every day here almost, Governor, who are deeply concerned about a ballooning deficit, maybe trillions more, if the Trump tax cuts are made permanent, which could have an inflationary effect. And this problem you're outlining gets even worse.
Well, what I will tell you is you don't have to be a math major to figure out that if you have $30 trillion in debt and interest rates are rising as they have done, and let's just say 5% of $30 trillion, we're going to spend $1.5 trillion a year as a country just on interest expense without even paying back any of the principal. And so I think that these are issues that maybe are not top of mind for every single voter across America, but it's certainly important to those of us that operate in the states. You know, we have to have a balanced budget in Mississippi. When I came in 20 years ago, we had a nearly 25% shortfall in revenues compared to the expenditures of the previous administration. And what we did is we went and we fixed it. And so I think good, strong policies, a growing economy will lead to more revenues for the government, and we're going to have to get control of spending.
So if we need to get control of spending and everything you just said about how interest rates are higher, it's going to take a lot more just to maintain the high debt levels we have. Why then pursue further tax cuts? Doesn't that not work mathematically?
Well, actually, I will tell you, I believe very strongly that government doesn't have anything that it doesn't first take from someone else. And the reality is that as you look at where we find ourselves, every single American knows better how to spend their money than any governmental entity ever will. Certainly the federal government has proved that, but we have proved it in Mississippi as well. We try to be smart and conservative with the people's money, but we've been cutting income taxes in our state. In fact, there are 9 states in America that have no income tax. Of the 41 that have one, Mississippi has the 5th lowest in America, and our economy is booming. Unlike other parts of the country, Mississippi has the lowest unemployment rate in our state's history right now. Mississippi also has more people working than at any time in our state's history. And that's because we have a tax-friendly environment. We have a business-friendly environment. We showed during COVID that as difficult as those times were, our people got up and went to work and took care of themselves. We need more Americans in the workforce. We need more taxpayers. We need more people pulling the wagon and less people sitting on the wagon.
You're talking about winning over rural voters, and I know that that's very close to your heart for obvious reasons. We talked to Congressman Brian Stile the other day talking about the hunting territory in northern Wisconsin that he's looking at. But we've been told by a lot of smart people that this election will be decided in the suburbs, that it will be women, that it will be young black men. What's the message to them?
Well, I will tell you, President Trump is currently polling better with young African-American men than probably any Republican has ever done.
That's right.
Certainly. And that's because that particular group also recognizes the same thing that every other American recognizes, and that is inflation. The fact that when they go and they put gas in their car, the money that they are earning is going less and less far.
But it's an
every
economic
single day.
message. We could talk about a lot of issues. You're striking the economy each time.
Well, I think at the end of the day, particularly those who are undecided, I mean, obviously, if you've got the hardcore conservatives on one side and the far left on the other, obviously, there are hot-button issues that those individuals care about. But the ones who are undecided, those in the middle, those that are independents, those are right-leaning Republicans that maybe have not always voted for Trump. I believe it's pocketbook issues. I believe it is economic message that is going to win the day.
Because you said pocketbook issues, I would point to a study that was just done by the Peterson Institute for International Economics that found that the tariffs that both J.D. Vance and Donald Trump have advocated for, a 10% levy universally, 60% on all goods coming out of China, would amount to an annual cost for the average middle-income family of $1,700. Are tariffs the right policy for middle-income people in Mississippi?
Well, what I would tell you is the right policy for America and the right policy for Mississippi is for us to bring those jobs that are in China particularly those production jobs and those other jobs that are situated throughout Asia, bring them back to America. It's about making America great again. It's about creating jobs for those individuals that we just mentioned that live in rural places. You know, we've got in our state, our message of bringing economic development and better and higher paying jobs to our state is a message that is winning the day. We've announced 3 different projects over a 15-month period of over $2 billion in capital expenditures in companies that are coming back to our that are building in America, building in Mississippi, and creating jobs that are paying 25, 30, 35% above the state average on wages. And that's the message that I think people want to hear is we need to be producing more things in America and less things in China.
Let's pick through a couple of other issues, and I know one that is important to you is abortion. This is something that we've seen addressed in the platform that I'll ask you about, but I want to bring our viewers and listeners back to your conversation. I remember it distinctly. In 2022, on Meet the Press, here's the governor.
What I would say, Chuck, is at the end of the day, there is no right to an abortion in the United States Constitution. That the issue with abortions that makes it very different is that there is a life. There is an American child in that womb, and it's incumbent upon those of us who are elected to stand up for the rights of those individuals that can't stand up for themselves.
Governor Reeves on Meet the Press 2 years ago. Now with this RNC, the platform approved on Monday does not include an abortion ban, a national ban, for the first time in something like 40 years. Is that a disappointment?
Well, I certainly support the opportunity for a national abortion ban. But what I will tell you is for that to ever pass the U.S. Congress, it's going to be an abortion ban at 20 weeks or 22 weeks.
Yeah. And
there are very few abortions, even in states like California and New York, as a percentage that are conducted at that late stage. In our state, and when we filed suit to overturn Roe v. Wade, arguing exactly what I argued on Meet the Press, that the Constitution doesn't guarantee a right to an abortion, our entire case was these are decisions that ought to be made by individual states. And so, to give you an example, in our state, we enacted a law which I understand is not politically palatable in some other states, but we enacted a law that has exceptions, but does not allow for the right to abortion in the state of Mississippi. My ultimate goal is to save as many babies' lives as possible. And there are a lot of different ideas as to how to make that happen. But the reality is, just because of our case that went before the United States Supreme Court, there are hundreds of thousands of babies that have been born, that have been saved, that are in American society now. And I will tell you, that's not the end of it. That's not all being pro-life is about, is being anti-abortion. We also in our state have worked very hard to create a culture where we're investing in moms, investing in babies, investing in pregnancy crisis centers to help those who are in need. We've made a call out to our churches, to our congregations, and telling them how important it is that they get involved and engaged. Because I believe very strongly that it's our churches and our charitable organizations can do a far better job helping expectant moms than any governmental entity can. It's just a fact that governmental entities tend to be inefficient, even in states like mine that are focused on this issue.
Well, Mississippi also, and I know you were just talking about some of the economic statistics, you're proud of the unemployment rate, et cetera, consistently has one of the highest child poverty rates in the country. Do you see no relationship there between very restrictive abortion laws and children who, yes, thousands of them perhaps have come into existence because of that law, but their lives may be of poor quality for it?
Well, I can tell you this. I would much rather see a baby that is not killed in the womb or otherwise, that has maybe a challenging upbringing. What we're trying to do is improve education to give every kid an opportunity for success. We have had some real progress being made in our state. But look, our state and virtually every other state, there are very few societal problems that can't be solved by more people having better and higher paying jobs. And that's where our focus is. And we have a laser focus on it in Mississippi.
Well, to put a finer point on it, Mississippi has the highest fetal mortality rate in the nation, highest infant mortality rate, highest preterm birth rate. Black women nearly 3 times more likely to die due to childbirth than white women. Is that the cost of a pro-life policy?
I do not believe it's the cost of a pro-life policy. I think that, as is often the case, there are areas in which we can improve. We are trying to address these issues. We have done certain things. I do not support Medicaid expansion, yet we have done things like guaranteed Medicaid for any pregnant mom in our state. We just did that during this legislative session. Just this past a year ago, we passed legislation to allow for Medicaid expenditures. Used to, that expectant mom could only get Medicaid up to 2 months after childbirth. We worked very hard with our state health officer, and one of the things that he, in his studies, determined, which was surprising to me, because when I looked at those statistics, I just assumed it was really young people, teenagers, et cetera, that were having these challenges, and that's not at all the case. Most of these terrible outcomes, and they are terrible, they're tragic, but most of these terrible outcomes are actually older females that are having not their first child, but their second child, and typically it's their second child within a 12 to 15 month period. And so because of that, we thought that we would at least try the process of giving those moms that have babies, rather than 2 months of Medicaid post-delivery, we're going to give them 12 months of Medicaid to ensure that they continue to go back to their OB, continue to go back to their physician, so that those individual physicians can help coach, can help teach, and can help do the work to try to drive those numbers down.
Governor, we just have a minute left, but given what you said about wanting to bring more babies into the world, if not a national abortion policy at the federal level, what about federal protections for IVF?
Look, I support protections for IVF. I am a supporter of that particular policy, and whether it's done at the local level or at the state level or done at the federal level, that'll be a debate that we have upcoming. But I do not believe that we should eliminate that option for potential moms, because again, I believe that we need to protect babies, and we need to love life and get more get more and more policies in place that give kids an opportunity for success long term.
Governor, thank you for spending time with us talking about some pretty serious issues. We appreciate that.
Thank you so much for having me.
Have a great convention.
Thank you.
Yes, indeed. Mississippi Governor Tate Reeves with us in studio in Milwaukee. Coming up on Balance of Power, we'll assemble our political panel. They're back, Rick Davis and Jeanne Zaino, on day 3 of the convention. Alongside Kailey, Leinz, I'm Joe Mathieu. It's next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. This is Balance of Power, live from the Republican National Convention in Milwaukee on Bloomberg TV and radio. I'm Joe Mathieu alongside Kailey, Leinz. It's day 3, Kailey. This is the big one. J.D. Vance, well, I guess second in line. The big one's tomorrow night, really, with Donald Trump. But this is going to be an important evening here. And some other familiar names on the list. We just got the speaker's rundown. Yep,
Congressman Matt Gaetz, Congresswoman Anna Paulina Luna, some others who, as we talk about this RNC trying to preach more a message of unity, will be interesting to hear from, given
Ronnie Jackson,
the conduct we have seen in the halls of Congress. I wonder what's different, Washington to Milwaukee.
Well, for sure. And Peter Navarro, fresh out of prison, will be speaking this evening, as will Newt Gingrich, the former speaker. This could be a little more of a red meat kind of night.
Yeah, and of course, I would remind all of our listeners and viewers that the theme of tonight is Make America Strong once again. This is going to focus heavily on foreign policy and also the military, which is notable considering that Senator J.D. Vance, the vice presidential nominee, was a Marine.
That's right. Let's assemble our panel for their take on all this. Rick Davis, Stonecourt Capital partner, Jeanne Zaino, Iona University, Bloomberg Politics contributors. Great to have you both at the table here on day 3. I'd like to hear from both of you just quickly on the conversation we just had with Governor Tate Reeves, because it is noteworthy that the Republican platform that was approved at this convention, as I mentioned to him, does not include a national abortion ban. Where does he fall in line with the MAGA side of the Republican Party?
You know, he's taking this line that, you know, what we do in Mississippi may not work for people across the country, but it's where we want to be. The problem is for Republicans on this issue, they are well out of step with the vast majority of Americans in saying leave this to the states, because the states, many of them, are restricting the right to choose. And now you have a nominee as a VP who doesn't even want exceptions in the case of rape and incest. And, you know, you think about the commercials we have heard, and more than that, the really impactful statements from victims of rape and incest who have talked about what has been their sort of plight in life as a result of being raped or having been molested by a family member and become impregnated. To not be given that option to do what they and their family members and their doctors think is best, that is a horrifying reality for women and men across the country. So I think that's where the governor finds himself, and many Republicans today. They don't want to put that out on the platform, but that's what Democrats need to be talking about.
Well, and especially so in these states that aren't like bright red Mississippi. States like the one we're in now, Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, the swing states that we know are going to decide the outcome of this election. Is abortion a losing issue for Republicans in those places?
Yeah, it's a challenge. But I think one of the things that the Supreme Court decision on Dobbs did, unleashing this debate at a state-by-state level, and we heard a little bit from the governor of Mississippi, is that it kind of disperses the talking point, right? States are going to choose for themselves what laws they're going to have passed. And, you know, when you look at a political strategy, it's like either make something so small, late-term abortions, you got to be against that. Everybody's against a late-term abortion. Or make it so big you can't get a handle on it. And that's where we are with abortion today. Every state's got a different talking point. And so the battle in Wisconsin will be focused on what Wisconsin voters want. It won't be overlaying a national law that bans abortion, which would have been orthodoxy in any other convention in the last 50 years.
How about that? So does Senator Vance, there have been a lot of questions about his take on exceptions. Does he need to be clear about his position on this tonight when he speaks to the RNC?
I don't think he'll address this. This is a red meat night, as you pointed out earlier. This is where we rough it up a little bit on Wednesday night. It's always the sort of case against the Democrats. And abortion is not one of the issues that this campaign is going to be waged on. Usually it's fought out in the platform committee on an internal Republican basis. But with the full embrace of MAGA into the Republican Party, centered around the cult of personality of Donald Trump, we don't have those fights anymore, right? That's a different party now than what we saw in the past. So I think you're going to hear orthodoxy tonight, MAGA orthodoxy. It's going to be about the border. It's going to be about foreign policy, national security. We've seen head nods by J.D. Vance and Donald Trump on what to do about China, what to do about Russia. So I think you'll get more stability around those issues, core Republican talking points against Democrats than anything else.
Well, as you speak about Russia, it reminds me that we can't anticipate exactly what people will say tonight. We do know what people said last night, though, including Nickie Haley, who was just extended an invitation to this convention days ago. She spoke. She said that Donald Trump has her strong endorsement. To quote her, "For the sake of our nation, we have to go with Donald Trump." And Jeanne, she specifically spoke to the people who voted for her. She said the targeted message to them is simple. You don't have to agree with Trump 100% of the time to vote for him. Did she surprise you last night with just how strong that endorsement was?
She did not. It was runners' night up last night, and they were out in full force. I'm not surprised if she was going to say anything different. I suspect she wouldn't have said anything at all. But it's so important to look at what was said last night, because you know what I heard on a night when they were talking about crime and safety? They were blaming immigrants in this country for crime. So not only are we days after a shooting where they said they were going to talk about unity, and they came out blaming immigrants for crime spikes. So the idea that they were going to change rhetoric, that has all but disappeared. But then let's look at the data. Violent crime in this country is down. Immigrants, 30% less likely to commit a crime in this country than people who live here. So from any stretch of the imagination that you look at this, the argument that they were making was offensive to those of us who are many of us who have friends and family who are immigrants, and to the facts on the ground, which don't support this idea that immigrants are responsible for fentanyl, overdoses, and violent crime in this country. So, you know, I wish Nickie Haley coming out, sure, endorse Donald Trump, but why doesn't one of you state the facts of the situation on safety and crime in this country and stop connecting it to people you're describing in Ted Cruz, rapists, murderers, borrowing Donald Trump's language from 2016. It was offensive to listen to. A good political show for sure, but not at all in line with the facts or anything a moral person should be thinking about.
Okay, well, let's get a taste of what you're describing here, Kailey, from last night. We heard from not only Nickie Haley, but also Senator Marco Rubio. Let's listen.
Donald Trump has my strong endorsement, period.
When President Trump was in the White House, Americans had more money and lower prices. Our borders were secure and our laws were enforced. Iran was broke, the Taliban stopped killing Americans, and Putin didn't invade anyone.
So, unity around Donald Trump. But how about everybody else, Rick? We were talking coming out of a very scary weekend for America about the unity that would wash over this convention, and we've heard that word from everyone who's come in here from the RNC. Is it happening?
Yeah, I think it's a false premise. I mean, we've had 2 days. We can judge from now as to whether or not the talking points that after the shooting on Saturday, the convention was going to focus on unity and try and bring the country together with this cataclysmic event. And really no evidence of that other than the talking points that the organizers of the convention put out. So, yeah, this is business as usual. I mean, what you heard last night was attacks on Democrats, attacks on constituencies, you know, like what Jeanne was saying. So, yeah, I mean, this is actually looking like a pretty straightforward Republican convention, could have been nominating anybody. I think they've just missed the whole opportunity to use this assassination attempt on Saturday to galvanize America around a Trump candidacy. And I think it's kind of, at this point, other than maybe tomorrow night when Donald Trump speaks, they've missed the opportunity.
Wow.
Interesting to hear you say that. We spoke with the RNC co-chair Laura Trump here in studio yesterday, who said that this convention was going kind of as she planned. She still expected they would fundraise significantly off of this, expected to see a bump in the polls in the aftermath. We also asked her, though, what the RNC would do if it turns out Joe Biden is not the Democratic nominee. And she said, oh, nothing changes. I don't believe that there's any polling that suggests another Democrat could beat Donald Trump. There is, though, polling that suggests that other Democrats could beat Donald Trump, or at least are performing significantly better than Biden in battleground states. It was published in Politico this morning, a memo from Blue Labs. Is this the kind of data, Jeanne, that might change President Biden's mind?
You know, President Biden saying it would take an act of God, I guess, to speak to him, to step down. And later he talked about data. It seems that it's hard to reach him with data. They may need to mail drop it into the White House at this point. But to your point, Kailey, the numbers are there. They are all over the place, and they're clear. There are other people performing better. And you've got House Democrats now circling and saying, this is going to be devastating, not just for the top of the ticket, but potentially we would lose the Senate and we won't be able to pick up these, you know, mere 5 seats in the House. We need to take this thing. So I hope President Biden recognizes what many Democrats do. This is not a coronation. This is a party. And he needs to battle for this nomination. Should they do this early, I think Chicago will be maybe the Chicago of 68. I hope not. But Democrats are going to be furious on the ground. It's not a coronation.
Well, I'll tell you, some of the numbers in this Blue Labs analytics memo point to alternatives, right? We see Arizona Senator Mark Kelly, Maryland Governor Wes Moore, Pennsylvania Governor Josh Shapiro, Michigan Governor Gretchen Whitmer, all outpacing Joe Biden by roughly 5 points across battleground states, and they're doing better than Kamala Harris, Rick. This is bringing us back to the conversation that we had with you the night of the debate. You say, clean slate, new ticket.
Yeah, I thought the debate was disqualifying for Joe Biden. I mean, people can't unsee that. 50 million people watched it. Hundreds of millions saw the aftermath, and we haven't stopped talking about it. It's one of those things that frankly just doesn't happen in a presidential campaign. When you nominate someone, you have to know they're equipped to take the fight, to the opposition, and he couldn't do it. And why should anybody believe he can in the future? The effort to try and fix the problem has resulted in Joe Biden willing to do some interviews, which have been disastrous. They haven't fixed the problem, they made it worse. And so why do they think that's going to work? Now they're going to take him to Delaware and put him back in his basement like he campaigned from in 2020, and maybe that's the plan. Just don't let anybody talk to him. Wow. The Democrats have a fundamental problem. They have a nominee that can't win. They believe that. 7 in 10 in the most recent AP poll said that Joe Biden can't win, and they're not going to support him. How do you build a winning coalition with that kind of situation? So, yeah, I think that it's not too late. Crazy things happen in September, and so we'll see where the Democrats go. But every day they demur, every day the debate continues on, they're missing an opportunity to take the fight to Donald Trump. And right now, Donald Trump's having a heyday. So I don't think you're going to hear anything other than calls to keep Joe Biden in this campaign. He's the rightful heir of the Democratic nomination. And I think that's very smart. In fact, I think I would suggest they don't just lay off arguing about Joe Biden in this convention. Let him have a free night, and because he's the best thing Donald Trump has going into Election Day.
Well, if we consider what the Democrats are doing, a new memo that came from the convention, the DNC's Rules Committee, in a letter to delegates today, talked about how the party is going to undertake a virtual roll call. There was talk of this happening on July 21st, next week. It will not happen until at least August, they say, Jeanne, probably in part response to all the backlash from the rumors about July. But is this the party that looks like it's just trying to get this locked up before any more Democrats can come out against Biden?
It does. And thank goodness they moved it. Yesterday we were talking 6 days. Now they've moved it a little bit, but it is not enough. The numbers show, if that's Joe Biden wants to see, they show he cannot, to Rick's point, continue down this lane. He had a disastrous debate. That debate was followed by an attempt to resurrect the campaign. The Lester Holt interview, thank goodness it wasn't viewed as much, but it was not a good showing. He is not to be the nominee at the top of this ticket. I suspect that he won't be by the time the convention occurs. But if they nominate him or appoint him, or anoint him is probably the right word, in August now, virtually, that is going to send the wrong signal. And all of the people that you mentioned, from Mark Kelly to Gretchen Whitmer to Josh Shapiro, Andy Bashir, there's a really strong Democratic bench, a lot of energetic young people who have positive numbers to show. Use them, and Joe Biden can help guide them from his, point as president, not running again for re-election.
All right, Jeanne, Zaino, and Rick Davis, our Bloomberg Politics contributors. Thank you both. We will see you later on the program. But first, we want to head up to New York as we broadcast live from here in Milwaukee and check on what's happening in financial markets today. Bloomberg's Abigail Doolittle is joining us with the latest. Hey, Abigail.
Hey, Kailey. Well, we have lots of red on the screen, but interestingly, it would not be accurate to say that markets are down. Markets are actually mixed. And I say this because the Dow Jones Industrial Average, that bricks and mortar equal weighted index, it is up about 0.5%. In fact, up for a 6th day in a row, while the S&P 500 down more than 1%, the worst day since late April, and the NASDAQ 100 down closer to 3%, its worst day of the year. This market action today has everything to do with the intersection between business and politics, because driving it has to do with the people in the White House and the people who want to be in the White House. Let me take you through the laggards first, because this is everything about big tech. A few things going on here. The Biden administration, first of all, saying that they're considering a greater crackdown on China chips. You then also have the former president, Donald Trump, telling Business Week in an interview that he is not so favorable toward Taiwan's positioning around chips. And then third, yesterday we were talking about the idea of advanced trade. J.D. Vance negative toward big tech, talking about a possible crackdown on big tech. So we see the likes of Apple, Microsoft, NVIDIA, and Broadcom down in big ways, down between about 2% and 7%. That's really incredible. Again, the worst day of the year. On the other hand, if we check in on the Trump trade, The best way we can see it, Berkshire Hathaway, really old school economy, also one of the most taxed companies in the world. So if taxes were to come down to that 15% rate that the former president is talking about, certainly would benefit. But we have United Health higher. We also have ExxonMobil higher. And then interestingly, Global Foundries, they have 2 chip plants right here in the U.S. That stock having its best day in the year. When we put this together, Joe, we see the rotation we were talking about yesterday, and that is essentially out of growth into value. Over the last 2 weeks, we have value up about 5%. We have growth down about 5%. So it's really interesting that when you put together the Trump trade and the Vance trade, this is what happens. But it is also important to note that the big tech trade, that's a huge weighting to all of these indexes. So if this kind of decline continues, it could really weigh on the market. We'll be watching very closely.
Bloomberg's Abigail Doolittle taking care of the markets for us today. We'll check back with Abigail a bit later, as always, as we turn our attention back to the Republican National Convention underway right now in Milwaukee, where Kailey and I are live alongside Morgan Ortagus, founder of Polaris National Security, former State Department spokesperson during the Trump administration. Lovely to see you at the table.
Thank you.
Hope the convention's going well for you, and it's great that you're here today because this is Geopolitics Day, international and national security as a theme at this convention. We're going to hear from J.D. Vance tonight.
Yeah.
Who doesn't love the direction that the United States has gone in with Ukraine, for instance? What are we going to learn in that speech?
So it's interesting that it is Foreign Policy National Security Day, which is what I've done for the past 20 years. That never happens at a Republican convention, right? Foreign policy is never the theme of an entire day.
How about that?
And I think from a Republican perspective, it just goes to show how wrong things are going around the world. We think, obviously in August of 2021, we saw 13 of our best young men and women killed in that disastrous withdrawal from Afghanistan. We, of course, in the Trump administration, I was a part of the Abraham Accords team. We handed four historic peace deals over. Then you have Afghanistan fall. Then, of course, you have Russia. You have Putin invade Ukraine. And then last year on October 7th, we saw the horrific murders from Hamas invading Israel. And I'm sure we will get reminded tonight, 10 months later, we still have 5 Americans that are held hostage by a terror regime. Not only do you have the president of the United States with an former president of the United States with an attempted assassination over the weekend. As I've been saying for years, this isn't new news. The Iranian regime has active plots on U.S. soil against former President Trump, against my former boss, Mike Pompeo, Brian Hook, and other senior administration officials. It's unprecedented that an enemy state of the United States would have these many plots against officials where they require, for the past 3.5 years, 24/7 security. Never happened in U.S. history. And then, of course, you're worried about what's happening with China around the world. And I think that Americans are very concerned. They're not only concerned about what's happening at the grocery store, but they're concerned because there feels like there is a chaotic world out there and that nobody is really in control.
Well, so let's pick a few parts of the chaos, shall we? You mentioned, for example, the war in Ukraine, which we know that J.D. Vance is not an advocate for continuing to fund in the U.S. He thinks some kind of negotiated peace is the most realistic outcome. Former President Trump, of course, has said he could end that war in 1 day. Do you actually believe that? What would a Trump-Vance ticket, president and vice president, ultimately mean for a resolution to that war?
So J.D. Vance is a good friend of mine. I think he's a great pick. But it is the president of the United States, if Trump is reelected, who sets the foreign policy. And he does that with the Secretary of State. And so the foreign policy will be up to the president. Having served in the last 2 years of his administration, and by the way, I've served in 4 administrations, Republicans and Democrats, so I've got a lot of background here. In the last administration, for the last 2 years, we actually provided lethal weapons to the Ukrainians. We had more sanctions and more actions against Russia than any president in modern history since the Cold War, since Reagan. And so when you look, not only were we providing lethal weapons to Ukraine, we were renegotiating New START. We were sanctioning Nord Stream 2. This is an energy discussion that I know you guys have had on Bloomberg. Why does that matter? Because it's not like we're pontificating about what foreign policy would be. We know that we actually took a very strong stance against Russia and supportive of Ukraine in the last administration. Unfortunately, there's a series of probably 10 to 20 different deterrence failures from the Biden administration that led to where we are today. I'm one of those Republicans who are incredibly critical of the delay of weapons over the past 2 years. And listen, if you look at it from an economic perspective, we have, the truth is that the Russian economy is doing better than it was before the invasion. The initial sanctions tranche, and I spent years of my life at the Treasury as an analyst doing sanctions, the initial sanctions tranche that the Biden administration did with the Europeans sanctions was fantastic, but it was never followed up on secondary sanctions. We never never took Russian banks off the market. We never prevented them from exporting oil and energy or from their minerals and mining. And so, even our LNG export ban in January, for example, we've seen billions of dollars, $21 billion just in 2022, that Russia gained from their LNG exports that they were able to use to fund their war machine. So the sad reality is they actually have figured out how to circumvent our sanctions, and they have this what I call supply chain of terror between Russia, Tehran, North Korea, and China, where they are able to resupply themselves from a munitions perspective with drones, ballistic hardware. They're actually resupplying themselves faster from a munitions perspective than the West can, and that's, I think, should be incredibly concerning to all of us.
Well, it's interesting. I don't know if you're implying that a Trump 2.0 would pursue secondary sanctions, because we've asked a lot of lawmakers about this. You would push for it. Okay. Well, that's really interesting, because Donald Trump says he can end this war on day one, that it's a phone call, this thing is over. We don't need secondary sanctions in a world like that. You've been in this game for a long time. Do you take a commander-in-chief seriously talking like that?
Yeah, I mean, listen, I think he has there's no doubt, if you look at it from a policy perspective and not a rhetoric perspective, we were much tougher on Russia than the Biden administration.
But how do you end a war in one afternoon?
Well, I mean, listen, we don't know if Trump is elected. We have no clue what we will inherit in January of 2025. So who knows what you're going to get there. So you'll have to deal with the situation there. Obviously, he's going to have a tough negotiation. So you ask yourselves, the people now who are negotiating to get 5 Americans out 10 months later from a terrorist group. They can't get these Americans out. They can't finish a negotiation between Israel and Hamas. These are the people that you think will be better negotiators than we are. When we negotiated the Abraham Accords, sorry, I know the negotiators. I was a part of the team. I'd bet on the Trump negotiating team every day of the week.
Who are you betting on will be Secretary of State as part of that team?
I think that he has a ton of people to choose from. I don't know if these people are interested, but I will just tell you what I think. I think Rubio is incredibly impressive. Bill Hagerty, my senator. Listen, I'm biased. I'm from Tennessee. He's my senator. Rick Grinnell has a very close relationship. Tom Cotton is another senator who's been in the foreign policy side for a long time. So I wouldn't be surprised if the president picks an ally from the Senate.
All right, Morgan, it was great to have you here in Milwaukee.
Thanks.
Appreciate your time. Former State Department spokesperson Morgan Ortagus. We appreciate it. Now, we talked a lot about the war in Ukraine, but there also is a great focus on China at this convention, especially with the selection of J.D. Vance as the vice presidential nominee. And that is something we spoke about with Alabama Senator Katie Britt yesterday as well. And this idea that both of these, both Trump and Vance, are protectionists. They are advocates for tariffs. And that does come at an economic cost. It could be inflationary, though what you're hearing Republicans say is it's too important that they make sure that American business is protected from China. So let's take a quick listen to what Senator Britt had to tell.
We know that places like China, people like the Chinese Communist Party, have undercut the American worker at every turn. So whether it is Alabama shrimpers or steel manufacturers, whether it is stealing our intellectual property, what they're doing, essentially stealing American wages and opportunity, is real. And so we've seen this in the last Trump administration. I mean, looked at our agriculture industry as they allowed President Trump to work to create a fair playing field for them. And so I am excited to actually take policies, then drive them down to how do they affect America? How do they affect opportunity here? Making sure that we're putting Americans, American manufacturing, American capability at the forefront of every conversation. Because look, when you go back to COVID, if we learn nothing else, it's that we need to secure our supply chains. And part of that comes from making sure that we're strategic and that we're intentional. And I think you'll see that with JD, and you'll see that obviously with President Trump.
And we want to continue this conversation on China now. We're joined by a member of the House China Select Committee, Congressman Carlos Gimenez of Florida, who's here with us in our studios in Milwaukee on Bloomberg TV and radio. Congressman, thank you so much for your time. We talk a lot about China because J.D. Vance, just earlier this week, after it was announced that he was the vice presidential pick, said that it is the #1 threat the U.S. faces.
Yes, it is. For now and the foreseeable future, China is the #1 threat that we face.
And how do you expect a Trump-Vance administration would address that? Is this purely tariffs, or is it something else?
No, it's, look, China has made no secrets that it wants to be the #1 economic power in the world. It wants to be the #1 military power in the world. They're now aligning themselves with Russia, North Korea, Iran to create a new world order. And the new world order doesn't include the United States of America. So that is the number one threat. It's a very brutal communist dictatorship. It oppresses its own people. It's accused of genocide. It uses slave labor. And I've been saying for a long time that we need to start to decouple from China as soon as we can. Much of our supply chain comes from China. We've become way too dependent on China. We need to bring back manufacturing to the United States, especially manufacturing that deals with our security, our defense industries. We're lacking. Look, in World War II, during World War II, for every carrier that Japan built, we built 6. And so we outproduced Japan. Right now, China holds an edge of 232 to 1 in shipyards. That's just one example of why China is to me, the biggest threat that we face, not only us, but the world faces, and now in the foreseeable future.
You talk about decoupling, Congressman. There's a Bloomberg report out today that has led to some pretty tough moves on Wall Street. We're watching semiconductor stocks fall sharply, and we've been through this before with trying to keep NVIDIA chips, for instance, away from China. But this report now suggests the Biden administration is considering using the most severe trade restrictions available if companies keep giving China access to these advanced chips. Would Donald Trump do the same thing?
I think he would. I think that he understands the threat that China poses. They frankly stole much of the stuff they're selling to us right now. They stole from us. All right. We invented the chips. Now their threat to Taiwan. Taiwan controls 80% of the chips. Right. And so if China were actually to invade Taiwan and actually then control Taiwan, they would control 90% of the chips in the entire world, which is kind of like what they do in everything they do. And so they subsidize an industry, they target an industry, subsidize it, then they flood the market, the world market, with that product. They drive all the competition out of business, and then they become the sole source, right? That's a pretty good way to run your business, but it's not a way to be a good partner in the world stage. And so I wasn't like this before. I thought maybe you open up China and trade, et cetera, and then they'll find that democracy is the right way, but they've gone the other way.
When did you change?
I changed when I went to China. I went to China when I was the mayor of Miami-Dade County, thinking that, well, maybe we can get some Chinese transportation assets for Miami-Dade County, et cetera. Okay, maybe they can invest in Miami-Dade County. And when I walked out, I said, I want nothing to do with them. Zero. Why? Because every time that I was dealing with supposedly a company, all right, I was dealing with the executives of the company. There was always a couple of people right over there, okay?
How about that?
That whenever I asked them a question, they would always look to those people over there. That was the Chinese Communist Party.
PRC.
The PRC. And the CCP was there, okay? And so, yeah, I said, well, no, not really. And then I didn't see the sun for about 2 weeks when I was there because of all the coal they were burning. And so here they are, a champion supposedly of green energy and part of the Paris Climate Accord, and yet they are polluting. They're the world's biggest polluter by far. So no, I didn't like the way they did business. I didn't trust them. And so I came away completely different opinion than when I walked into China. So that was very beneficial to me. And you know what? President Trump was right. Senator Marco Rubio, who I'm pretty good friends with, he was right. Yep, they're the biggest threat that we have.
Well, you bring up Senator Rubio, another Florida man, obviously, who was not selected for the vice presidential pick. But Florida is an interesting case study, as there has been suggestions, given abortion, for example, that it may be a state in which Democrats could more easily play this cycle. I'm sure you probably don't actually believe that. But we are seeing interesting demographic shifts, even if it's not an entire state being up for grabs.
Yeah.
Latino voters going over to Donald Trump. Same with black voters. And what do you assign that to? Why is that happening?
Ronald Reagan once said back in, I think back in the 80s, or maybe in the 80s, when he was president, that Latinos, Hispanics, or Republicans, they just don't know yet. They're starting to figure it out. We hold our same values. We have family values. We're people of faith. We believe in hard work. We believe in the American dream. And we are Americans. We want the same thing everybody else does, So, they're coming over. We're coming over. No, Florida's not in play. Florida's going to go big time to President Trump. Even in Miami-Dade County, my home county, which is pretty, it was historically a big Democratic stronghold. that's lessening by every single election. And you see that in the polling data. You see that in the results from 16 to 21, from 16 to 20 to 22, the huge shift in Miami-Dade County itself. And if the Democrats don't come out of Miami-Dade County with a huge lead or buffer, right, they're toast. And so they're not going to come out of Miami-Dade County with much. I think Donald Trump has a really distinct possibility of actually being the first Republican president in a very long time to actually win Miami-Dade County.
Wow. At this Republican National Convention, the party has more than 70 influencers, as they are known, credentialed as part of this convention to try to deliver the message, reach out to younger people, talk about the platform and so forth, many of them using TikTok as a platform to do that. Does that bother you?
Yeah, it does. Absolutely.
Should the RNC tell them to not do that?
My advice, look, I mean, I know that there's still
the campaigns are
there's over 100 million users of TikTok. I understand that,
including Donald Trump, right?
But eventually, look, we passed legislation on that that TikTok needs to divest itself from Chinese communist influence or divest itself from ownership within 6 months or a year, or else it has to cease operations in the United States. So TikTok has concerned me, continues to concern me. But as long as there's still over 100 million users, I understand the reasons why. But does it bother me? Yeah, it bothers me.
Well, thank you for bringing us your view from the Select China Committee and from here in Milwaukee, Congressman. It's great to see you at the table. We thank you. Florida Congressman Carlos Gimenez with us here on Balance of Power, a special once again from Milwaukee on what is now day 3 of the RNC. And Kailey, we're not only covering the Republican National Convention, but a lot of headlines that have to do with Joe Biden. He's about to do another interview today on Univision, and now this.
Congressman Adam Schiff, a Democrat, obviously, now calling on Biden to drop out of the race. This is according to the Los Angeles Times. Schiff, of course, is running for Senate in the state of California. We have seen this trickle of Democrats coming out in favor of Joe Biden leaving the race. It was on pause for a bit after the assassination attempt last weekend of Donald Trump. But Adam Schiff now apparently joining the ranks.
He had been talking with donors, saying that the Democrats would lose, according to reports. Now he's saying it out loud, it seems, Kailey. This is something that we'll talk about coming up later with our political panel.
This is Bloomberg TV and radio live from the RNC in Milwaukee. Live from the Republican National Convention in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. Alongside Joe Mathieu, I'm Kailey Leinz. It is day 3 of the RNC. The theme is Make America Strong Once Again. It is all about foreign policy as we await the headliner of this evening, a speech from Vice Presidential nominee J.D. Vance.
Yeah, that's right, Kailey. J.D. is his biggest night, likely the biggest speech he will have delivered in his political career. And there are a lot of questions about what exactly he's going to be harnessing with, in some cases, a little bit of sunlight between he and Donald Trump and the Republican Party gathered here in Milwaukee. We'll hear talk about Ukraine, I suspect, Russia, and of course, China.
Yeah, just to name a few, of course, this is going to be the first time for many people that they will get to know the ideas of J.D. Vance in a more material way when it comes to foreign policy. A lot is known about how he feels about domestic policy, given his memoir and his illustrations of his upbringing in poverty in Ohio and the deal with drug addiction and stuff. I wouldn't be surprised, too, to hear him talk about fentanyl specifically when he talks about China, which also gets us to the border.
And just his personal story in general, which seems to resonate with the 50,000 delegates and other Republican Party members here in town. Our colleague Anne-Marie Hordern spent some time earlier with one of the bold faces at this convention, was once said to be on the short list for a running mate. That's the governor of Virginia, Glenn Youngkin, who talked to Anne-Marie about a number of issues today on Bloomberg TV and radio, including this theme of unity at the RNC.
The Republican National Convention, as we move into day 3, has been a real statement. It's been a statement about coming together and excitement. And when President Trump came into the arena on Monday night, and it's the first time that everyone had really seen him since the assassination attempt, the place erupted, and it was emotional. And I think it does represent not only confidence in the America that he built last time, but the one he can build again.
So would you go work for him? Because he says he'd love to have you on the team.
Well, it's an incredibly humbling sentiment. Let's be serious. Right now, the job is to win. And Virginia's in play, which is amazing to say. Joe Biden won Virginia by 10 points last time. And then we came back and won by 2 the next year. And all the polls have Virginia locked up tight. So I'm going to go to work to one, be a great governor in Virginia, and then second of all, make sure that we do everything we can for Donald Trump to win.
So is there a sense if you flip Virginia and it goes red, you would join this administration? If you were asked to serve your country under President Donald Trump, would you join?
There's so many ifs there. Let's just start with the work at hand. And I'm a pretty basic businessman who's become a governor, which is set objectives and let's go meet them. And we set the objectives in Virginia to turn around Virginia's job growth and economy. And we've used all of the tools that we know work. We have had $5 billion of tax relief. We've streamlined regulations in a big way. We've built a great workforce and we've invested in our infrastructure. And, you know, we were just ranked the top place for business, and that's because we really are the top place for business. So my job's really straightforward. Set objectives. Let's go meet them. One of our objectives is to make sure that our congressional candidates win in Virginia, that we extend our majority in Washington, and to help Donald Trump win Virginia.
You mentioned your business acumen. You were part of the business world, the head of Carlyle. What I was hearing is that a lot of individuals on Wall Street were calling the former president, asking him to pick someone like you. Instead, he went with J.D. Vance, someone that sometimes unnerves Wall Street. He's a protectionist individual. He's a populist. He's calling for tariffs. One of your biggest importers coming from China. How do you think Virginia would handle, say, 60% tariffs on China and a 10% tariff ring around the United States?
Well, let's first back up. I think one of the things that President Trump has been clear about, and we know in the business community, is that free trade really doesn't exist because we've given unfettered access to the U.S. market, and so many other countries actually don't provide reciprocal access to their markets. And let's be clear, U.S. companies do not have access on an unfettered basis to the Chinese market, and yet they expect to have unfettered access to the U.S. market. And so we've got to stand up strong for the United States. On top of that, China is not just a rival. They're trying to dominate the world, and they're trying to do it at the expense of the United States. They use economic imperialism to do it. They saber rattle, and on top of that, they use every ounce to infiltrate every bit of the U.S. Economy to understand how they can influence it. What that has translated to is a real recognition that we need to not only protect ourselves against China, but we need to fight back. And so the tariffs that President Trump imposed on China when he struck the first Chinese deal were critical in order to rebalance an unbalanced situation with China. And companies that are doing business in China, take Ford, for example. I mean, here's Ford, who has a big market share in China, and then they want to build an electric vehicle battery plant in the United States. And I can guarantee you that the Chinese government put immense pressure on them to use cattle technology in the United States. And now we're seeing that cattle technology is being banned by the U.S. military because they're worried about the influence from the Chinese Communist Party. I mean, this is the way China does business, and we've got to make sure that we're fighting back.
Most economists, though, say tariffs are inflationary. So do you think that's the right solution to this problem you don't think is currently free trade on the marketplace?
Yeah, I do have to begin with, I have lots of economist friends and worked with them for a long time. And
well, the Peterson
economists
says
are right and wrong.
$1,700 per every household. They ran all the numbers.
Well, I know. People ran lots of numbers at the beginning of the year and said there was going to be 5 rate cuts this year in the United States. Come on, let's be real. At the end of the day, I believe that President Trump will use tariffs in order to make sure that trade is reciprocal and fair. Fair for the United States, fair for U.S. businesses, and fair for the U.S. worker. And that's really important.
He also thinks the dollar is too strong. Do you think we have a currency problem?
Well, I think the first issue we have with our currency reflects the lack of strength, the weakness that the Biden-Harris administration has projected economically around the world. And a weak America invites a strong China. And China has moved right in around the world economically, and all of a sudden you hear once again all of these threats that the dollar will not play the role that it has internationally going forward that it has historically. That's a real challenge to the U.S., and it's a real challenge to our economic future. So I think that part of the reason why the the electorate in Virginia and around the country are excited about President Trump coming back into office is strength. Economic strength, national security strength, border strength. They're tired of a weak America. They want a strong America.
But how do you think he actually fixes that dollar problem?
Well, first of all, having an economy that actually works.
But that might mean a stronger U.S. dollar. Like, a lot of people are looking at what these potential policies could be, especially protectionist trade policies. And they would say, that looks like it's going to be a strong dollar.
Well,
Does the Fed need to get involved?
clear.
Does the Treasury need to, maybe buy other foreign currencies?
Well, let's go back to core basics. A strong U.S. economy that does not have runaway inflation, which is what the Biden-Harris administration unleashed on America. Unprecedented inflation. We haven't seen it for decades. That drives a dollar up because interest rates have to follow. And Jay Powell's done a really good job combating inflation. Let's be real. I mean, beginning of the year, there was huge pressure for 5 rate cuts. And of course, inflation was nowhere near contained. And he's done a really good job maintaining discipline. We've got to get inflation down, make sure that it is, and then rates will come down, and rates will drive the currency. And that's a strong, high-growth, low-inflation economy that is not allowing inflation to drive too strong a dollar.
Well, you said earlier the market was expecting 5. Now the market expects 1 or 2, one of them likely before the U.S. election. Do you think Jay Powell, if he is to cut rates for this U.S. election, is being political?
No, I don't. I think Jay is doing his job. And as we have seen the Biden economy really falter, Jay's going to react, and he's going to do what he needs to do. And so, no, Jay's not political at all. Jay's doing a great job.
J.D. Vance is the VP pick. I want to give you a quote of what he put on his campaign website, black and white, before he ran for the Senate. We're going to raise taxes on companies that ship jobs overseas and use their money to fund anti-American radical movements. Does corporate America have a place in this Republican Party?
Well, first of all, let me begin with JD's nomination. I think he's going to be a great running mate for the president, and I think he's going to do a great job as vice president. And let's be clear, it is Donald Trump's agenda. And Donald Trump is going to set the agenda on the future of our economy and how we are going to build a rip-roaring economy again, just like the one we had in his previous administration. And yes, the business community clearly is excited about this. Listen, the stock market ran away over the last few days as it's become more clear that Trump is leading and has a better than likely chance of being elected as president. I also think it reflects the catastrophe that Joe Biden has been over the last couple of weeks coming out of the debate for the Democratic Party. I mean, there's chaos on their side. And Wall Street and the markets and business seem to really support this because the market's running away. That's really exciting, I think, for the opportunity to build a strong economy, a strong America, and to put us back where we belong, which is leading as opposed to really defending weakness all the time.
That was our colleague Anne-Marie Hordern's conversation with Virginia Governor Glenn Youngkin here in Milwaukee, Wisconsin earlier today, where we are broadcasting to you live from the Republican National Convention. I'm Kailey Leinz alongside Joe Mathieu on a day in which here in Milwaukee we are talking a lot about foreign policy, expecting China as an issue to come up. And China and chips are at play in the markets today as the NASDAQ is having a pretty bad day. It's down the better part of 3 full percentage points. So let's get a check on that now with Bloomberg's Abigail Doolittle. So Abigail, what's the why?
It really is a bad day for the NASDAQ 100, and it has to do with exactly what you were talking about. Chips, White House policy, the former president, Donald Trump, his comments around Taiwan and chips. And I would also say it has to do with J.D. Vance's stance around technology and big tech and a possible breakup. But let's keep it simple and start off with chips. So we have the S&P 500 down 1.4%. There's a lot of weighting there to chips. The worst day since late April. You were mentioning the NASDAQ 100 being down closer to 3%. Sticky? This is the worst day since December of 2022. That is the degree of selling power. If you recall, that was a horrible year for stocks. So investors had been so positive on the Nvidias and the other chips in the world, not so much the stocks. The chip index itself down 5%, at the lows down closer to 7%, the worst day since October of 2022. So when we break it down to those individual stocks, of course, I was just talking about Nvidia, which has skyrocketed over the last year or two on the promise of AI, but you have have the Biden administration recently coming out saying that they are considering a greater crackdown on chips specifically from China. And so that geopolitical ripple has really put a damper on NVIDIA, AMD, ASML. Interestingly, the Dutch holding company, chip company, they put up a fantastic quarter, but that stock down 11% as, again, geopolitics get in the way. But I was talking about big tech in general being down, and J.D. Vance making this nod toward the idea that big tech should maybe be broken up, a fan of Lina Khan's. We have Apple and Meta down, or excuse me, Microsoft down for another day. But we also, this is really interesting, and it speaks to the antitrust part. Meta and Amazon, if ever you could think about technology companies that were going to be broken up, those are it, down 3.3% and 5.2% respectively. And of course, after the assassination attempt, Joe, last weekend, the Trump trade, so to speak, or maybe this would be the Vance trade, big tech trading lower, taking a big move, given the fact that there are lots of indications, including the predicted betting odds, that in fact the former president has a big lead over Joe Biden.
Yeah, Bloomberg's Abigail Doolittle. Thank you, Abigail, for the update on the markets here. Kailey, it's something that we were just talking about with Congressman Gimenez, these new curbs that are being reported by Bloomberg from the Biden administration on high-tech chips. We've seen this before. They would be even more strict. Questions about what that would mean in the Trump administration.
Yeah.
But I'm kind of curious. I mean, we're talking about the JD trade now. Does the vice president set the policy in a Trump 2.0?
Well, I guess we all have to wait and see. But when we were speaking with Morgan Ortagus a few minutes ago, she said foreign policy does come down to the discretion of the president of the United States. But of course, those surrounding him, I would imagine, have at least some influence. It's hard to know with Donald Trump.
Yeah, tracking the elusive Trump trade and the JD trade now as we reassemble our panel. Rick Davis of Stonecourt Capital and Jeanne Zaino of Iona University. Great to have both of you here. Rick, this is interesting. The narrative in Milwaukee is that Donald Trump is going to win the election, but Wall Street is moving today on something that Joe Biden is reportedly about to do. How do we rationalize this?
Well, I do think it's not inconsequential that the Biden-China policy is a mirror image of what he got from Donald Trump when Donald Trump left office. I mean, there's very little difference between what the Biden administration has said and done about China and what Donald Trump did and is continuing to talk about. He's very aggressive in what he says about China. I think what's interesting off of our Newsweek story is all the traction that sort of taking the foot off the accelerator of Taiwan that Donald Trump did has had some kind of an effect. And so that's the difference between the two on China. Full-throated support for Taiwan militarily by Joe Biden, including the violation of strategic ambiguity on a regular basis that the White House had to walk back. And Donald Trump being very clear that maybe it's more ambiguous than you thought it was, and maybe they should do more to take care of their own defense, and maybe they should spend more money. So long story short, I think that there's a China trade, and I wouldn't imagine there'd be much difference between that trade in a Biden administration and a potential Trump administration.
Yeah, it's an excellent point on Taiwan. Trump, of course, told our colleagues, Nancy Cook and others at Bloomberg Businessweek in an interview a few weeks ago when they asked about Taiwan, that maybe Taiwan should just be paying the United States for any protection that it wants, to summarize his words, essentially. As we consider this idea of everyone has to be a hawk on China, Jeanne, Democrat or Republican, it does seem to be pretty politically popular any way you slice it. But the conversation we keep having is being tough on China. Congressman Gimenez saying he wants to decouple from China comes at an economic cost at home. Any economist would likely tell you that. What is the appropriate, responsible way to message this to American voters?
Yeah, I mean, I think your conversation is exactly right. There is very little difference between the policy of the Trump administration and the Biden administration. And presumably if Trump comes after or Biden, it's not going to change that much. But what does change is the idiosyncratic nature of the way Donald Trump does foreign policy. And I think the example that Rick just gave about Taiwan is an excellent one. You know, should they be paying for security? This is what a Trump 2.0, to borrow your words, Joe, a Trump 2.0 means for people across the world. They don't know what to expect. And it is that sort of uncertainty that impacts the markets. And that is a troubling sign for people around the world. He likes to make deals. He doesn't care who he's making deals with. It doesn't have to be allies. He will throw them over the bus. And so that is where this uncertainty comes into play. So on China, yeah, Democrats, Republicans across the board, everybody's going to be tough on China. It's going to come at an economic cost. But there is also a difference between these two foreign policies. And you talk to our allies, particularly those on Ukraine, and they are nervous about what is going to follow if Trump is indeed reelected, as we're hearing.
I've always been told that voters don't make decisions based on foreign policy, that will not be in the minds of voters when they go to vote in November. Morgan Ortagus just told us this is highly unusual. Maybe you might disagree, Rick, but for an RNC to capitalize on geopolitics, foreign policy as a theme for an entire day, is this simply a different election because of it?
Well, I think that there's open questions about where the Republican position is on foreign policy. Donald Trump doesn't have that kind of consistent vein, a North Star, as it would be on all things global. I mean, you know, very aggressive on China, but very unaggressive on Russia. You know, he's got friends who look more like authoritarians and Democrats. So I think this is a level setting. I think a little investment here sort of blocks a weakness that the Trump administration may have coming into this administration, even though he was already commander-in-chief once and has a plank to talk about what he did to keep the peace around the world. There are still lingering questions. You see it in the survey data. And by the way, it's a weakness of the Biden administration. No question that war in Gaza has caused him a lot of problems, and his withdrawal from Afghanistan really hurt him.
All right, well, we'll talk more about President Biden with Rick Davis of Stonecourt Capital and Jeanne Zaino of Iona University coming up in just a few minutes as Congressman Adam Schiff, the Democrat from California, adds his voice to the chorus of members within the president's party calling for him to leave the race. We'll have much more still ahead from the RNC live in Milwaukee here on Bloomberg TV and radio.
This is Balance of Power live from the Republican National Convention in Milwaukee. Bloomberg TV and radio, I'm Joe Mathieu alongside Kailey Leinz with breaking news, not just on Republican politics, but in fact, Democratic politics and specifically the Biden campaign. Kailey, you know you're onto something when Donald Trump takes to truth. What was the post? From a political standpoint, Donald Trump writes, an unprecedented event is happening. The Dems are trying again to get Biden off the ballot. And that's, of course, because a prominent senator has just weighed in.
Yeah, we have had a number of voices weigh in. Obviously, at this point, well over a dozen members of Congress, sitting members. Congressman Adam Schiff, the Democrat from California, who is running to be a senator from that state, now calling for Joe Biden to drop out of this race. In part, his statement says, a second Trump presidency will undermine the very foundation of our democracy, and I have serious concerns about whether the president can defeat Donald Trump in November. And as we've learned in recent weeks, Joe, he is not the only one. The question is, does Joe Biden have those concerns about his ability to defeat Donald Trump?
Well, that's right. A lot of questions here that we pose to our panel. Rick Davis of Stonecourt Capital is with us alongside Jeanne Zaino of Iona University, Bloomberg Politics contributors. They are our signature panel. How nervous does this make you?
It does. So Adam Schiff was reported to have said this to private donors before. It is something that he is concerned about, not just that we lose at the top of the ticket, that they can't hold the Senate and that they lose Congress. And coming from Adam Schiff, this is an important statement. And I am curious to see if others do follow. We also understand that the president had words with Jason Crow, a war hero in the House, who
you brought this up.
who was saying that, you know, President Biden apparently people aren't getting the message of what positive things you've done on foreign policy, given the convention is about foreign policy tonight. And the president responded by saying, you need to do a better job getting out and speaking on my behalf. But it is Joe Biden who's got to speak on his own behalf. And that has not proven to be something he is capable, at this point at least, of doing and reaching voters and convincing Democrats that he should stay on the top. I mean, Rick just told us a while back, 7 out of 10 Democrats saying he should get out. So he can tell Jason Crow he needs to communicate better. But Joe Biden has to own the fact that he is misstepping on communication on his own behalf.
Okay, so let's talk about some of that communication. As we know, yesterday he sat down for an interview with Ed Gordon of BET News. Excerpts of that have now been released. And in part, Rick, according to what he said to BET, he says that if some medical condition emerged and his doctors told him it was a serious medical condition, then he would consider dropping out of the race. He says his doctors have not told him that, to be clear. But is this the kind of thing you should be saying when you're trying to plead your case?
Well, maybe being 81 is a medical condition unto itself. Look, that's a big departure from where he was just a day ago, where he was reiterating that only the Almighty could get him out of this race. Now, where there are cracks, there's a break. And we know that Adam Schiff's comments only reflect a much broader debate going in through the Democratic Party that just hasn't broken out publicly, right? There's a universal concern about this ticket's ability to win. And the fact that Republicans are doing better all over the ticket, they have a reason to be concerned. And yet the time is running out. They have a convention coming up in 3 weeks, and they have a nominee that they want to try to dump. And there's only so much time to do that. They have to prosecute a campaign in the fall, and they are not ready for it. And this is the kind of thing that I think will just fester now, because even Joe Biden, President of the United States, has said there's a condition under which I will get out of the race.
Mm-hmm. This call that you mentioned, Jeanne, with House Democrats, including Congressman Jason Crow, Donald Trump, and some reporters got their hands on the Zoom call, which is why we know about this. This was not public. Donald Trump said, "You saw what happened recently in terms of the meeting we had with NATO. I put NATO together. Name me a foreign leader who thinks I'm not the most effective leader in the world on foreign policy. Tell me who the hell that is," he yelled. Isn't that kind of Trumpy?
For a moment, you think you are reading Trump's words. And it is that kind of argument to a war hero like Jason Crow, that makes Democrats feel uneasy, or more than uneasy, about what is going on. The reality is, people in Congress know that their future and the future of the Democratic Party, and quite frankly, for many Democrats, the future of the country, depends on keeping Donald Trump out of the White House. And they feel that they are at risk right now. And so they are desperate for the president to look at the data that they are seeing on the ground, particularly those folks in red districts or purple districts who feel they should be running ahead of the Republicans, and they could be doing a better job, but the top of the ticket remains too weak. And the bar the president keeps moving is problematic. First it's God, then it's the data, now it's his health. He should look at what the people are saying. Give us a better choice. You've done a fabulous job. Step out, and we will thank you. But give us somebody who can move this ticket forward and keep Donald Trump out of the White House.
Well, if you listen to what 15,000 voters are saying across the 7 swing states that were surveyed in interviews by Blue Labs that just released a polling memo, they said effectively that basically all other Democrats would do better than Joe Biden. Alternative Democratic candidates ran ahead of Biden across those 7 swing states by an average of 3 points. Nearly every tested Democrat performed better than the president, including Vice President Kamala Harris. But Harris runs behind the average alternative. So it's one thing to have the question about the fate of Joe Biden. It's another about who would step in his place. Is Vice President Harris going to be just as big of a problem for Democrats potentially?
Look, I think that once you crack it open, once you start having this discussion that says, somebody other than Joe Biden, then I think all the cards go on the table. I think you start looking for who's the best candidate to run against Donald Trump. And I think you've now pointed out what I think a lot of Democratic strategists I know would prefer. Find me a governor from a targeted state in the Northeast, like Michigan, like Pennsylvania, where we have a chance of locking down a couple of the key blue wall states in order to prosecute a campaign. I mean, there are going to be lots of reasons, in addition to the polling data, that Democratic strategists are going to think through how to manufacture a ticket if it starts with no more Joe Biden. I don't think there's a right to the nomination by a sitting vice president if the president in the top of the ticket withdraws.
That's important because a lot of people think that she does deserve that. But we're also talking about this idea of what, a mini primary, maybe a series of town halls or debates. I think Rick has been implying that a deal needs to be made here, Jeanne. What would Democrats think if there was an announcement of a new ticket?
It would not fly. I mean, they are going to have to hold. We saw like James Carville, others have been talking about how they could do this. There is no easy way to do this. But if Joe Biden decides to step down, I don't think somebody can be anointed from a back room. That is not the Democratic way of doing things. They are going to have to find very, very quickly at this point a series of town halls or some methodology of allowing people on the ground to hear from these folks, whether it's Shapiro, whether it's Whitmer. You know, there's a lot of people, Gavin Newsom and many others, hear from them and have a voice in the decision. Anointments, we go right back to 68. They don't work quite so well, and nor should they.
Well, I thought it was very interesting last night. In her speech, Nickie Haley specifically talked about Kamala Harris when she was talking about how during the course of her primary campaign, she said a vote for President Biden is a vote for a President Harris. Yeah. And she hit that repeatedly. I wonder if we'll hear more of the same.
Keeping our options open.
The next 2 days here at the RNC. Rick Davis of Stonecourt Capital and Jeanne Zaino of Iona University, our political panel, will be sticking with us. We'll be back with you in just a few minutes. But let's get some more insight into what exactly we could expect to hear in tonight's speeches. Bloomberg's Tyler Kendall is here with a preview. And of course, the headliner tonight is J.D. Vance, Tyler, and the theme is foreign policy.
Yeah, hey, Kailey. Well, it's interesting that J.D. Vance's speech comes on the night when foreign policy is the theme, because he's been one of the staunchest opponents to Ukraine aid in the Senate. Now, I've had the chance to catch up with him multiple times in the halls of Congress throughout the year on this issue, and he has been consistent that one of the biggest reasons why he is against this is that he wants to see the U.S. defense industrial base revitalized first. Interestingly enough, that was actually the argument that got bipartisan approval for that big supplemental security assistance package that sent aid to Ukraine, Israel, and the Indo-Pacific. But the difference here, so we saw bipartisan lawmakers talking about how this would create more jobs and revitalize our factories. But the difference here when it comes to Vance is that he wants to see our stockpiles replenished first before we send those weapons abroad. And he normally talks about this when we're talking about competition with China and China boosting its own domestic manufacturing, and also when it comes to American jobs building this equipment instead of sending those jobs overseas. So, Kailey, we're definitely going to be watching how J.D. Vance threads the needle on Ukraine aid and then also on China, which shortly after he received the nomination called the U.S.'s biggest threat.
Of course, J.D.'s the headliner tonight, J.D. Vance, Tyler, but we just got our first glimpse of the official speaking schedule. Who else are we going to hear from?
Yep, well, we're going to hear from former President Trump's son, Donald Trump Jr., as well as some other members of Congress. That includes Congressman Michael Waltz, a Republican from Florida who's a veteran and also serves on House Foreign Affairs. That kind of goes with the policy and the theme of foreign policy tonight. Also, Doug Burgum is going to take the stage. He, of course, was one of those names floated around as a potential vice presidential pick for former President Trump. And now there's talk about whether or not he could end up with a cabinet position, and also his ties to some big donors that might help the Trump campaign moving forward.
Really interesting. Doug Burgum, not with the rest of the runners-up we saw last night. Tyler Kendall, thank you, reporting from Milwaukee for Bloomberg as part of our coverage here at the Republican National Convention. As we now reassemble our panel, Rick Davis at Stonecourt Capital and Jeanne Zaino, Iona University, are with us here in Milwaukee with a lot more to talk about ahead of tonight. We mentioned some of these names already. What does that mean when you see a Burgum like that, not lumped in with all the other losers last night? Does that mean Donald Trump has bigger plans for him? I say loser with,
you think Secretary Burgum? I mean, Governor Burgum.
Literal sense, yeah.
Yeah, no, I think that it's definitely a status symbol, right? There's a hierarchy to where you have, what day you have the speech and what time of the slot you have. So he's getting an A slot on a B night.
Okay.
And so I think it's definitely shows how much cooperation he's given to the campaign, how much they think of him as a surrogate. And I think you'll see him a lot, in the fall campaign promoting the ticket. So yeah, I think it's a definite endorsement of Governor Burgum's rise in the Republican Party.
Well, so the question becomes, does Governor Burgum have a role in a second Trump administration? Because it's not just about Senator J.D. Vance and the vice presidential nominee. It's also about what the rest of the cabinet is going to look like. Is the speaker itinerary a peek into what Donald Trump's cabinet 2.0 could look like, Jeanne?
It absolutely may be. And that is a fun bingo game to play. Who's going to be in this cabinet? And I think Doug Burgum, I mean, I remember when he announced his run, so many people outside of his home state said, who? And now, of course, he is almost a household name. So he is somebody who could very well be tapped for the cabinet. He has an awful lot to bring to the cabinet. He, of course, represents a more, I would say, established traditional view of the Republican Party. So he would be a really interesting pick. But there are so many others out there, and we're hearing from some. But the thing I like about Doug Burgum today is he may break up some of what will be the sort of more red meat we will hear from people like a Matt Gaetz or, you know, some of the other folks who we know are going to be speaking. Donald Trump Jr., who is obviously not only son, but one of the president's closest advisors, and with Tucker Carlson likely had a big hand in the decision to appoint J.D. Vance. So it's going to be, I think, one of the most interesting fun nights, if I can say that, at the convention.
Well, how lucky are all of we to be here in Milwaukee to bear witness. Rick Davis of Stonecourt Capital and Jeanne Zaino of Iona University, our Bloomberg Politics contributors. Thank you both so much. Now, we want to keep checking on the markets as the NASDAQ is on track for its worst day since December of 2022. Investors concerned about comments from both President Biden and former President Donald Trump when it comes to China. Bloomberg's Abigail Doolittle is joining us now with a look. Abigail, it's ugly out there if you're a tech stock.
It is certainly ugly, and it's not every day that you can say that tech is influenced by the White House and those that want to be in the White House, or in other words, the intersection between business and politics, because we do have that NASDAQ 100 down and down hard, as you mentioned, almost down 3%. The worst day since December 15th of 2022, as you mentioned. That was a very bad year for stocks, so that's the degree of the selling power that we're seeing here. And it has everything to do with the Biden administration floating the idea that they may crack down on chips even more than they already have. And specifically, they're talking about introducing the Foreign Direct Product Rule, or the FDPR. It's considered draconian because basically foreign-made products that use even the tiniest amount of technology, amount of American technology, could be imposed under those sorts of tariffs. So ASML is one company that's being targeted directly. That stock down 11.6%. But when anybody thinks chips at this point, it's NVIDIA, AI, that parabolic uptrend not so long ago. It had been the world's most valuable company. Now it's down on its 50-day moving average. That's one level of support. And Kailey and Joe, it looks like it could go down more, which suggests folks think that geopolitical pressures could weigh even more. But you were mentioning President Trump, former President Trump. He, of course, in a Business Week interview, was not so kind toward Taiwan's chip business. And so there's another weight there. And J.D. Vance making comments around technology, very open about the idea that he could be open to some sort of a crackdown. Amazon and Meta could certainly be under that sort of scrutiny given those sprawling businesses, and they, of course, are down more than Apple and Microsoft. I will also want to bring in the one macro picture, the dollar versus the yen. That is a haven move. The yen is up more than 1%. It is now hitting an important level of resistance. It looks like it may keep going higher. This tells us that investors are seeking some safety. This, in turn, pressures stocks because the quote-unquote carry trade comes off. But largely, Joe and Kailey, this has everything to do with the Biden administration potentially getting tougher on chip makers and China chips, I should say more specifically.
Bloomberg's. Yeah, we got you, Abigail. It's really something. We've been talking about them throughout the day here with a lot of folks in Milwaukee with their eyes on foreign policy. Abigail Doolittle, we thank you. Let's have the voice now of Bloomberg's Adriana Lowenkron, who has been covering this convention for us in Milwaukee, coming off a remarkable weekend. Adriana was a witness to the attempted assassination of Donald Trump at that rally in Pennsylvania. It's great to see you at the table. Thanks for joining us. You've had quite a week. You've seen a lot of wild things, and I wonder how you're connecting the dots in your own mind between what you saw firsthand on Saturday to what's unfolding right now in Milwaukee. We've heard a lot about unity. Are you seeing it? Are you feeling it?
I definitely am. I mean, this was a historic event, and, I'm glad I'm safe. The former president is safe. Yep. And, you know, the fact that we are still here carrying on business in a sense as usual, it's still something that I'm trying to wrap my head around. But of course, notable because the goal here for the Republican Party is to be united as Republicans are trying to take back the White House. And so we know from our reporting that the former president, who's set to speak tomorrow, has revamped his speech to do just that. We know that both his former rivals on the trail, Ron DeSantis, Nickie Haley, they came out kind of throwing their support and trying to do just that, which is unite the party.
Well, as we consider the idea that it is business as usual, I guess that's just means, you know, the convention is still ongoing, because I'm imagining Milwaukee is not usually like this with the security barriers that are up and the checkpoints. I mean, it is pretty intense here. Sure, it's for good reason, but talk to us a little bit about that, going in and out of this convention, just how tight that security is, especially in the aftermath of this past weekend.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely a process to get from A to B. If you look at the map, I think I only have 10 minutes to get there. It should be fine. And then you find out you go over a bridge, over another bridge, just to go back to where you are. But there definitely has been increased security presence. You're going through the metal detectors, which I will note, there were metal detectors and security at the rally and previous rallies as well. I've been doing this for so long, it was definitely unexpected. But yes, you can feel that heightened sense of security here, but you also feel the excitement from people who are here.
I don't know if you've had a chance to spend much time inside the hall, but with Saturday in mind, we're seeing delegates on the floor showing up with bandages on their ears. This has become one of the, I guess, novelties, points of tribute in this convention hall. In some cases, just a piece of white paper stuck to the ear. How does that hit you when you see it?
Honestly, the first thing I thought of was that scene in Mean Girls where you have the, you know, the person who has power and is respected to doing one thing, and then everyone else doing the same thing, following in the footsteps. But again, it really shows he is the party's leader. The fact that he, after the assassination attempt took place, stood up, you know, with the fist in the air. He was trying to remind everyone and let everyone know things are going to go on. That has been kind of a pattern that we've seen with his legal woes, with the trial, fundraising off of all of these things, showing everyone that he is back, he is in power, and we're really seeing that here.
Well, as we talk about him being in power, obviously he had a great hand in the platform that was adopted at this convention, including the lack of a federal abortion ban call for the first time in decades, for example. There was a lot of talk coming into this convention, though, to what extent Donald Trump would be communicating with the Heritage Foundation when it comes to Project 2025. This has been an attack line from the Democrats. They are running with this. Donald Trump has tried to distance himself from it. I believe you've been at a Heritage Foundation event or two while here in Milwaukee. What is your sense of what that relationship actually is when it comes to these policy ideas?
Right. So, I mean, as you said, we know that a lot of the people who put this together were former allies of the president. So for him to come out and kind of distance himself, we have our reporting to say just the opposite. And so the reason I went to this Heritage event was to really get a sense, talk to some of the people there and see how they were addressing Project 2025. You know, obviously we have how Democrats have been labeling it. We have what Trump has said. But this gave me the opportunity to speak to people there. And, you know, Tom Homan, former ICE official, was there, and he and I chatted for a bit. He kind of said he didn't have much to do with it, but he did say that in general it's common for think tanks to kind of put forth policy proposals, and he did say that at the end of the day it is going to be up to Trump to decide what to do if he were to get reelected. Well,
were they talking about Donald Trump, connecting the dots, or are they running cover for him when it comes to 2025?
Well, when I spoke to Kevin Roberts, who kind of at the helm of Heritage Foundation, he said that there is what the RNC is doing, there's what the campaign is doing, there's what Heritage is doing, but he did say there is an overlap. So take with that what you will.
All right. And I guess we will. We shall. And we'll see how this is messaged at the Democratic Convention in Chicago.
Oh, you'll be hearing a lot more about it.
I am sure that we will. And Hadriana, of course, will be there with us too. Bloomberg's Hadriana Lowenkron, great reporting. And we also are glad you are safe. Thank you so much for joining us from here in Milwaukee. Now, on set, in the seat that Hadriana is sitting in, we had several guests yesterday, including one that is not only a member of the Trump family, but now finds herself to be the co-chair of the RNC. She was here with us yesterday on Balance of Power. Here's a little taste of our conversation.
There is such support for this man out there, and we are so blessed, obviously, to have these great supporters. But we're bringing in new supporters, and I think that is what ultimately matters. And so we're going to continue on that trajectory. We're going to continue fundraising, and we're going to put all that money to good use. Election season is right around the corner. I think we're 60-some days away from early voting starting.
Well, so as we consider the use of the money, knowing you were just talking about all these people who are using their dollars to express their support for Donald Trump for president, there's only so much he can do as president without the buy-in of Congress. So the composition of the House and Senate is also going to matter for actually getting his agenda across. To what extent do you plan to allocate those resources into some of those more difficult races to either flip the Senate or retain the House?
Well, it's huge. It's everything. It's obviously we want to win the White House, but to your point, you can't do that much other than executive order if you don't have a House and a Senate. And we certainly want to expand the lead in the House and take back the Senate. And obviously we have our partners at the NRCC and the NRSC who are primarily responsible for those races. But look, anywhere we as the RNC think we can be a value add and give a boost that is needed, we certainly will turn our attention. You look at a lot of very important congressional races in states like New York and California. You have some, Montana's a big state as well. And so wherever we see that we are needed, we will be there as the RNC.
Our conversation with Laura Trump, who spoke at the Republican National Convention last night. As we turn now to the congressman from Arkansas, Republican French Hill is with us in Milwaukee. It's a who's who here in Wisconsin, and now the convention is real for us, sir. It's great to see you. We have spent so much time talking in Washington about policy, frequently financial regulations, crypto, but I think of you first and foremost as an establishment Republican, an old line GOP guy, and we're hearing a lot of different ideas at this convention that might reevaluate what that actually means to be a Republican when we're talking about tariffs. In the case of J.D. Vance, a higher minimum wage. Is this still the Republican Party that you recognize?
Sure. I think the Republican Party's always been a big tent party. And since the Reagan administration 40 years ago, we've made an effort. How do we get working Americans back engaged with the Republican Party? And one of those things is to be talking about jobs, opportunity, workforce, bringing jobs home from overseas locations. Many rural communities were devastated in the 90s when so many companies took their manufacturing offshore. And President Trump in his first term used his leadership to redo the North American Free Trade Agreement to the USMCA. He brought jobs and investment back to the U.S. with that, has made us the preeminent place to come do manufacturing. And of course, he got some trade concessions from China and Japan during his term. So my view about Donald Trump and tariffs is that is the ultimate stick to bring people to the table. And over my career in economic policy, I've seen a lot of presidents use that. President Reagan himself, voluntary auto restraints, VRAs against Japan, limiting semiconductor imports back in the 80s. So this is not an unfamiliar territory for Republicans.
But when we think about what, for example, increased tariffs on China will actually mean economically, not just for China, but here at home. I've asked this questions to a lot of your colleagues, and I'm not sure I'm really getting a straight answer because economists, and you sit on the Financial Services Committee, you are hoping to be its next chairman. So I know you know how this works. Higher tariffs raise the costs of goods. This is going to be an inflationary policy, is it not?
We have two trends, major macro trends that are both inflationary, aside from the overspending in Washington and lax monetary policy, and that is tariffs and reshoring. Both are going from low-cost supply, single sources in a faraway land, to trying to be near-shoring or friend-shoring, if you've heard that term. Those things also raise prices in the short run. They may be better in the long run for redundancy and resiliency in supply and fair pricing, and also across the board tariffs can be very inflationary. That's why I say if you use it as a cudgel, it's a good economic tool. If you use it across the board, period, full stop, and just say we're going to penalize one country in all product categories, you're going to create, in those product categories, high prices for American consumers. So I think it's about that constructive tension. My days in public policy, we used it as a cudgel to open up markets for American export, American intellectual property to be treated fairly, and I know that's where the president wants to achieve with China, for example.
Yeah, with China in mind, We're looking at the NASDAQ tumble here today. It's down about 3% at the moment. ASML, have you seen this, Kailey? Down $126 a share, 12%. NVIDIA is lower. This is Bloomberg's story that's driving a lot of this, that Joe Biden is going to make even more strict the restrictions on high-tech chips from China. Think AI, of course. When we see a move like this, knowing that Joe Biden is down in the polls, you're looking forward to another Trump term. Do you think that the Wall Street reaction is appropriate? Would Trump do the same thing?
Well, I believe that the president's executive order about limiting outbound investment in critical technologies like AI or chips is too broad. And I prefer a green light, red light approach where we name a particular technology, a particular intellectual property concern, or even an exact company and say, this company is off limits for American investment. I think that's the better way to go. When you say, well, we're going to limit technological innovation in AI, what does that mean? Every company, every entity is thinking about AI, and I think that does not give clear market signals about what U.S. policy is for national security purposes. We all want to limit China's access to our dual-use intellectual property that they're now turning and using against us in an international warfare sense.
So
that's true.
You like this policy?
I don't
You
like.
just want a more direct approach.
I think the kind of approach that President Trump used, where we had lists at the Commerce Department, lists at the OFAC list, at the Treasury, a DOD strategic company list, that's a better way to go because it's a green light, red light situation and not a broad ban on global investing by U.S. investors in AI. I think it's too vague. I think we need to keep working on this.
I'd like to talk about another form of technology, crypto technology, which of course you are passionate about. You chair the Digital Assets Subcommittee in the House. Both Donald Trump and J.D. Vance are pretty crypto positive, it seems. Donald Trump increasingly so, but we both know there's only so much power the president has to assist with regulation. Congress has to write a lot of those rules. What could Trump and Vance do on their own if they don't have both chambers of Congress? Knowing how difficult it has been to get legislation through the House, it has happened, obviously, during this Congress, but the Senate is a whole other ballgame.
Well, I think being pro-innovation for digital assets is a good position for President Trump. He's been very outspoken on it. He's against a central bank digital currency where the Fed at retail offers a digital currency. That's a bad idea. But being pro-innovation is good. So how could he do that? Well, he can appoint people at the CFTC and the SEC that are actually for economic growth and for limited regulation and for focusing how to build a digital future instead of relying on old laws. We wrote the FIT 21 Act, which specifically does that. We give direct authority to the SEC and the CFTC to regulate digital assets. Some of that could have been done by exemptive relief or by regulatory proposal by the SEC, and Chairman Gensler chose not to do it. So we're giving him the direction that he needs to do a good job, and I would hope President Trump, if we don't get that bill passed in this Congress, I would hope it'd be the first bill that we could get on his desk from the House Financial Services Committee in 2025.
To Kailey's point, Donald Trump says he wants to be the first crypto president. But then you read this business.
He does have an NFT, you know.
Well, that's true. No, he's making money on crypto. Bitcoin went nuts at the beginning of this week. And of course, around the whole conversation of Joe Biden's acuity, it's been crypto positive for prices. He also said in an interview with Bloomberg Businessweek that he'd keep Jay Powell on to serve out the rest of his term. Is that surprising to you, and do you agree with him?
Well, I think Chairman Powell, I don't agree with every decision that Chairman Powell has made as Fed chairman, particularly by letting inflation run, which he did in 2020, and with his policy change and then saying it was going to be transitory when many of us on Capitol Hill absolutely were on the record saying it absolutely is not. And Larry Summers, Democrat, agreed with that point of view. But Jay Powell is a capable leader at the Fed, and I think it makes complete sense in a presidential transition to let that Fed chairman serve out his term and then make a determination. Then the president can reappoint Mr. Powell or pick someone else.
Should the Fed chair and the rest of the FOMC, for that matter, feel comfortable cutting rates before the election if the data warrants it?
I think only if the data warrants it. I've been very, as you know on this show, I've been not seeing that data warranting a cut here in the near term, but we're looking at it every month. And they need to have the independence to do the job they think is appropriate in the Fed. I value Fed independence. We've had it both ways in American history, and I prefer an independent Fed.
We heard in Jay Powell's hearings on Capitol Hill last week, a few Democrats suggest that a cut or even a hike in September will be billed as political because of its proximity to the election.
Well,
you buy into that?
Look, I think everyone on the Open Market Committee knows that anything they say or move they make one way or the other between now and the first Tuesday in November is going to be deemed political by one side or the other. They're very
Should
sensitive
that keep them from doing it?
No, I think they've got to stick to their knitting. But this is why I prefer rules, like the Taylor rule. I prefer an analytic approach instead of a Kentucky windage approach, or as my friend Jim Grant says, a PhD standard for setting rates as opposed to the gold standard or a mathematical approach. But look, they're going to be under criticism regardless. And I think they need to do what's right because inflation is costing our families thousands of dollars more. And it's a key reason why I suspect that President Trump will be reelected because of Joe Biden's mishandling of the economy at a key moment, which is how it costs for households and property and casualty insurance and rent and gas and groceries, all the things you cover every day.
All right, well, Congressman, we always appreciate you joining us here at Bloomberg.
Great to be with you.
Congressman French Hill of Arkansas, of course, of the Financial Services Committee and hoping to be its next chairman.
You said it. We'll have a lot more, of course, with Congressman Hill when we get back to Washington, D.C. In the meantime, join us for a later edition of Balance of Power, 5 p.m. Eastern Time. We'll be joined by Wisconsin Senator Ron Johnson here on Bloomberg TV and Radio.